So today we're going to talk about some practical tips and techniques that will help us as caregivers to communicate more effectively with people with dementia. As I was sitting there waiting for my turn, I started getting pretty nervous, and I thought, you know what, I could really simplify things out, and I could change this title to how we always communicate more effectively with the person that has dementia. And the answer would be, it's impossible. Good night, everybody. Drive careful. And I'd be off the spot. But one of the things that I think is really important before we start talking about tips to communicate is to really go back and say, what is it like to have dementia? Because how can we communicate to someone if we really don't know what they're going through? If we don't understand their fears and their struggles and this disease and how it affects a person, we can't be effective. I love the book, The Best Friend Approach to Dementia Care. They suggest that having dementia is like going on a long trip to a foreign country all by yourself. The language is puzzling, the customs are different, the toilet doesn't flush the same, trying to order food in a restaurant proves to be difficult, shopping brings up fears of being shortchanged, and they ask us, could anything make this scary trip enjoyable? A best friend. A best friend that understood the language, could read the signs, help us order the food that we like, look out for our best interest, help us out when things got confusing, let us know what's going to happen before it happens. And I have a dear friend that's here today, Nancy, and the thing that I have loved about knowing Nancy is that she's so honest when it comes to describing what it feels like to have dementia. She was diagnosed probably back in 2005 with early onset Alzheimer's. And unlike some people with dementia that work so hard to put up this front and almost guard themselves so you don't realize everything they're going through, Nancy very openly and honestly shares so much of what she's going through. Back in 2006, it was after she received her diagnosis, her and I both sat on a conference advisory committee. It was for a dementia caregiver educational series. Nancy had been an RN, just an incredible person. She's about my age, great public speaker. And during this time, Nancy was living by herself in her home. She kept it immaculate. She would drive herself to the meetings, articulated her words perfectly, stayed on task, just was an incredible help to the seminar. And yet after one of our meetings, Nancy came up to me and said, Yvonne, during that meeting, it was as if somebody reached up and shut me off. And I don't know how long I was gone. And then it was as if somebody reached up and turned me back on. There were snacks on the table that hadn't been there earlier. The topic of the conversation had changed. 2 people had left the room. And Nancy said, I just sat there praying. I hope I didn't embarrass myself. Another analogy that Nancy describes dementia, she says, it's like there's a dial on the side of your brain, and it controls all your brain functions. And this dial has a range that goes from 10 all the way down to 1. And when the dial's up to 10, Nancy would say, I feel good, I'm functioning normally. But when that dial turns down, she would say, I couldn't even finish the task at hand. One day, it was a few weeks after this conference, Nancy made a trip down to Saginaw to visit friends, family. It's a trip she had made dozens and dozens and dozens of times. But on her way back home, she was driving along, and all of a sudden, Nancy had no idea where she was at or how she was going to get home. She was approaching an intersection, so she pulled into the gas station. She sat there for a moment. The dial turned back up. Well, she knew this gas station. She filled up here all the time. Recognized the restaurant across the street. Read the road sign that she hadn't noticed earlier. She was right on track. This is her normal turn. And Nancy asked herself, how could I have been so lost in such a familiar setting? One night Nancy was home, her own home, sound asleep. She woke up because she had to go to the bathroom. So she walked down the hallway, and the door on the left went to her bathroom, and the door on the right went outside. And she opened the door on the right. And there were steps, so she walked down them. There was a path, so she followed it. And then, as the dial turned back up, Nancy realized she's outside, pitch black night, in her pajamas, and had no idea why. Nancy had wandered. But it wasn't because Nancy didn't want to be in her home. It wasn't because she wanted to be someplace else. Nancy had simply followed the cues in her environment. So it would be very unfair for us to label Nancy as someone who was discontent with her living situation. Although very often in dementia care, people are unfairly labeled aggressive, combative, resistant to care, uncooperative. And I'll give some examples later on. One point that I thought Julie did such a good job was talking about how us as caregivers have to be careful that we don't buy into the labels that are sometimes stuck on people. Yes, I know that there's people out there that are grumpy and ornery and cranky, but as caregivers, we can't let that interfere with the care that we're giving. And oftentimes it helps just to step back, look at the bigger picture, realize they're in chronic pain, realize that that could be part of the reason they're irritable. Or I've heard people say, oh, he's just a loner. Could depression be what's causing him to isolate? One more Nancy story. I love it because Nancy explains exactly what she does during the day. One thing she'll do is make herself reminder notes. Take your medication. Eat breakfast. Feed the cat. Take a shower. And then she checks and double checks these notes. And it's so exhausting and so frustrating. And just to go through the normal activities of daily living when you have dementia is draining. There have been mornings when the dial's down and Nancy will confide in me and say, it would have taken me so much energy and concentration to walk through my morning normal hygiene routine that I've considered skipping it. It doesn't mean she's always there. She has great mornings. But as caregivers, the better we get at assessing where that dial is, the better we will be as caregivers. Why? Because we need to offer as much assistance to someone as they need. But yet, if we go up and button their shirt when they feel fully competent that day, we're going to make them feel inadequate, incompetent, and that's the last thing we want to do.